As many of you already know, awesome. I see Nathan coming in back there. This is his first time in church, right? All right, little Nathan Shutters back there, Zach and Katie. Nathan was born, give me the date again. August 21st, and so he's here for the first time. And so let's just give him a hand. Awesome. He won't remember anything about this, but that's okay. We're in this study in the book of Genesis, and we're continuing through that. If you're joining us for the first time this morning, and we're walking through the story, and we're continuing the story this morning of Jacob and Esau. This morning in the first service, I asked how many people watch American Idol, and I had just a few people kind of sheepishly raise their hand. So I asked again, how many of you watch American Idol? Patty's proud back there, just shooting it up, yeah. So, anyways, you might remember a few years ago, Mandisa Hunley. Mandisa was one of the finalists, and I think it was maybe 05 or 06. And the story goes that when she met with judges, then Simon Cowell, Paul Abdul, and Randy Jackson, to find out if she had made it through to the next round, eyeing Mandisa and seeing that she was kind of heavy set, Simon Cowell said, "Do we have a bigger stage this year?" Do you remember that? When she entered the room to learn the judge's verdict, Mandisa looked right at Simon and she said, "Simon, a lot of people want me to say a lot of things to you, but this is what I want to say. Yes, you hurt me, and I cried, and it was painful. But I want you to know that I've forgiven you, and that you don't need someone to apologize to forgive. And I figure that if Jesus could die so that all my wrongs could be forgiven, I can certainly extend that same grace to you. And Simon, I just wanted you to know that." He got up from his chair and he walked over and gave her a hug and apologized. This morning, we are looking at the story of Jacob and Esau, and we're coming to the point in the story where Jacob and Esau are meeting again after 20 years of being estranged. 20 years of kind of not sure where each other stood. And so this morning, we're going to review just a bit. If you're joining us for the first time this morning, you might be going, who are Jacob and Esau? I think I remember something about them, but let's put this just a little bit in context. The story of Genesis kind of turns a little bit with the story of Abraham, and you remember God begins to focus on this one guy and his family. And he says, I'm going to fulfill my promise through you and your family. So he calls Abraham to leave his land and to come to a new land. And in this new land, God says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Everybody that blesses you will be blessed, and everybody who curses you will be cursed. And God promises, ultimately, we know the fulfillment of this promise is through Christ, because God is building a people, and then out of that people, he will come into the world and redeem the world. But you remember the story. Abraham leaves and he goes, and he's old, and his wife can't have kids, and he's thinking, how's God going to work this out? Well, God miraculously gives his wife a baby, and they name the baby Isaac. Can you remember that story? The story continues. Isaac gets older, and he's like 40 years old, and he's still not married, and Abraham's a little worried. How's God going to fulfill the promise with my son who's 40 years old and not married yet? And so he sends a servant over to his homeland, and they find Rebekah. And you remember, she comes back, and she joins Isaac. And, okay, it's all going to work out now, but there's another problem. Rebekah can't have kids. And for 20 years, Isaac prays for a child. And you remember the story. Finally, finally Rebekah conceives. And not only one child, but she has 2 children in her womb. She's having twins. And those twins are Jacob and Esau. And so this morning, as we look at the story of Jacob and Esau, you might remember some of the events we've talked about in previous weeks. Jacob was not a nice guy, right? He's a trickster. Now, Jacob and Esau were different. Esau was kind of the hairy guy, the man's man kind of guy, and Jacob is the guy who kind of stays around the kitchen. And one day, Esau is out in the field, and he is hunting, and he comes in, and he's very hungry, and Jacob's got a bowl of stew, and he says, "Give me some of that stew." And Jacob says, "Well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you the stew, and you give me your birthright." Esau says, "Whatever, I'll do it." and he trades his birthright for a bowl of stew. Now, after the transaction is completed and after his stomach's full, he's probably thinking, that was a pretty bad deal. And he feels like Jacob tricked him. And whether or not Jacob tricked him there, or if Jacob was just simply opportunistic and took advantage of the situation, we know that later Jacob does trick his brother, right? Because he goes in while his brother is off hunting. His brother's getting ready to receive this blessing from his father Isaac, and Jacob goes in dressed as his brother. He's actually got goat skins on his hands and on his neck. And he tricks his father into thinking that he is Esau, and he receives the blessing from his father. Now, this is a big deal in this culture, and Esau is ticked off, isn't he? He's ready to kill Jacob. He's thinking, there's no way I'm going to let this guy live. As soon as my father passes away, I'm going to murder my brother. And his mom knows that, so she arranges for Jacob to escape to this place called Padam Aram with her brother Laban, and there he lives for 20 years. Now, we have gone through the story together, and I won't rehash it all, but he gets 2 wives. In fact, he's tricked into getting 2 wives, and you have to just read the story if you weren't here. But the deal is that he's 20 years in this place, and God comes to him, and God says, look, I want you with your family to go back to the land of Abraham. See, I'm doing something in that land, and I need you to be there, and so I need you to leave Padam Aram. I need you to go back. Now, that might not seem like a big deal. Okay, let's just pick up the stuff and move, right? But there's one problem. There's Esau, right? You see, he left the land, and he left the land for a good reason, because he was going to get killed. And going back might mean that he would be killed again, right? So this is where we pick up the story this morning. Jacob heading back to this land where his brother Esau is there. And you remember 2 weeks ago we went through the story. He packed it all up. He started back, and he gets to the place where he's just about to go into the land, and he has this all-night wrestling match with God. And we won't go into all the details, but that's where we left off last time. And then he wakes up in the morning, and now it's time to go and to face the brother, Esau. All right, so turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 33. This is where we're going to be this morning. And we're not going to go through every word of the text, but I would encourage you to have the Bible open, because I think you'll want to look as we kind of move through this together. Jacob's getting ready to face Esau, and we read in verse 1, Jacob looked up, and there was Esau coming with 400 men. All right, you feel the tension in that verse, right? I mean, Jacob's probably thinking, all right, this is it. He's going to take me out. He's been waiting 20 years to take me out. And now he's got his chance. He's got 400 men. All he has to do is give the orders, and I am toast. That's probably what he's thinking at this point. Well, Jacob has a plan. Look what at the end of verse 1. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 maidservants. Put the maidservants and their children in the front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. Now, this is strategic, isn't it? And it gives us some insight, doesn't it, into Jacob's priorities, right? It's got the maidservants first, because if Esau attacks, who's he going to take out first? People in the front, right? And then Leah and her children, and then we've got Rachel and Joseph in the back. And this is setting the stage for what Matt's going to be talking about next week. You know the story of Joseph, don't you? We're going to get into that next week. This coat that he wears, and this verse gives us an indication that Joseph is pretty special, right? He's in the back. And so he's getting ready for this meeting here. But notice, Jacob is no coward, right? I mean, if you knew that you're going to meet your brother who's been ready to kill you for 20 years, and he's got 400 men, I don't know about you, but I think I might be going the other direction, wouldn't you? But Jacob moves toward him. Look at verse 3. He himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. So he's bowing down. Not once, not twice, but 7 times. Now, what does all this mean? Why 7 times? Well, we're not entirely sure what this 7 times means, but it seems to be that a way of him kind of placing himself in servitude to his brother. We do read in ancient text of vassals coming before Pharaoh and bowing down 7 times. So it's an appropriate kind of thing. It's something about the ancient mindset. This 7 is kind of the perfect number. But notice Jacob placing himself in a servant's position to his brother. Now, do you remember the prophecy about Jacob and Esau? When they're in the mother's womb and they're jostling around, and God comes to her and tells her what? The old or the younger will serve the older, right? So isn't Jacob supposed to be the one being served by Esau? But it's flipped around here. And we've got Jacob bowing down to Esau. What's all this about? You know, I think that it has something to do with what's happened in the past, don't you think? I think it has something to do with the way that Jacob is confessing what he did was wrong, you know? You know, Esau, I really messed up. I really didn't do the right thing. I tricked you. And you remember this wrestling match with God that just happened prior to this? I think Jacob's a different person here, isn't he? And his posture, I think, is the sort of posture that you and I need to have as we approach someone that we need to be reconciled with, don't you think? The posture is that of saying, I'm wrong. It's a posture of humility. It's a posture of meekness. Now, this posture of humility is not unlike that of Jesus, is it? But Jesus didn't do anything wrong. Jesus doesn't have to bow down because he is asking forgiveness for his sins. But Jesus is God himself bowing down in a servant's position, washing the feet of his disciples, giving his own life for you and for me. It's a posture of humility. And that's the same posture that Jacob has here as he approaches Esau. I think it shows us Jacob's a different person here after encountering God. Now, how's Esau going to respond? Let's see what happens here. Look at verse 4. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him and threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. And they wept. Now, I think the key word here is that word but right there, isn't it? I mean, Jacob's bowing down. Esau could have said, take him out, boys, right? But he doesn't. He runs to him, which is crazy if you're in the Middle East. Men don't run in the Middle East. I mean, that would be undignified, right? Men walk everywhere they go. They never run. But they're running. Esau's running here. And he meets him. And he throws his arms around his neck. And he kisses him. And they weep. Does this sound like another story that you know of? Maybe in the New Testament that Jesus told? Do you remember the story of the prodigal son? Luke chapter 15. How does the father respond? I just want to show you this text. Look at the similarities here. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Same things happening here, right? So we've got Esau, who is very similar to the father in the story of the prodigal son. He's just glad that Jacob's back, right? He's glad that Jacob is bowing down in humility and saying, I'm just glad to have you back. He picks him up. You can just imagine him. Don't bow down. Stand up. Let me hug you. He kisses him. I can imagine that tears are streaming down both of their cheeks in this reconciled environment. It's a beautiful picture. Really, what happened? I mean, this doesn't look like the Esau we knew, right? I mean, we thought he was the hairy guy, you know, the man's man kind of guy who would take out anything that came in his path, right? That's who we think of when we think of Esau, right? And now here he is running and throwing his arms around and giving a big slobbery kiss to Jacob, right? I mean, this just doesn't seem like the same Esau. What had been going on in his heart, in his life? God had been changing him. So instead of bloodshed, we've got reconciliation. No anger, no hostility, no revenge. Jacob continues to address Esau with respect. Look at the next few verses here. Verse 5, Then Esau looked up and saw the women and children. Who are these with you? He asked. Jacob answered, "These are the children God has graciously given your servant." Look at the language there he's using. Notice Jacob calls himself a servant. Jacob introduces his family to Esau in the next few verses. Verses 6 and 7, we see the family bowing down. The maidservants and their children approached and bowed down. Next, Leah and her children came and bowed down. Last of all, Joseph and Rachel, and they too bowed down. Verses 8 and 9, Esau asked Jacob why he sent the gifts. Have you ever been, at a table out to eat with somebody and they bring the check, right? And you're like, I got it. And then somebody, no, I got it. No, I got it. No, I'll get it. No, I insist I get it. That kind of dynamic. That's what's happening here. And Esau says, look, you didn't need to send gifts. Jacob says, oh, yeah, well, I wanted you to have them. Well, I don't really need them. I've got plenty. No, I want you to have them. They got to go back and forth a little bit. And finally, Esau says, okay, I'll take them. He insists in verse 33, or chapter 33, verse 10. No, please, said Jacob. I found favor in your eyes. Accept this gift for me, for to see your face is like seeing the face of God. Now, this is an interesting part of the text here, I think. Esau's face is like the face of God, Jacob says. Now, what's all that about? What does he mean by that? I think what's been happening here is Jacob understood that Esau should have killed him, right? If he would have gotten what he deserved, he'd be dead now. But instead, he got an embrace, a kiss, and reconciliation. And what Jacob, I believe, is saying here is, Esau, you have responded to me in the same way that God has responded to me. When Jesus told the story of the prodigal son, it was a picture of God, wasn't it? The father running, the father throwing his arms, the father giving the prodigal son what he did not deserve. And what Jacob is saying about Esau is, Esau, you are very godlike in the way that you've handled this situation. I deserved death, you gave me grace. I deserved to be killed, but instead you offered forgiveness. A beautiful picture of reconciliation. Esau's face is like the face of God. And Jacob continues to insist that Esau accept the gift. And in verse 11 we read, and because Jacob insisted, Esau accepted the gifts. Esau offers provision to accompany Jacob on his journey there in the text. You'll read that. Jacob says, no, the women and the children move slow. I'll go at my own pace and I'll catch up with you later. We read in verse 16 and 17, so that day Esau started back to Seir. Jacob, however, went to Succoth, where he built a place for himself and made shelters for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth. So Jacob goes back, and scholars tell us from the place that they meet to Seir, where Esau is from, is about 100 miles or so. So Esau makes his way back. And I think it's interesting, too, that the word Seir literally means hairy. Isn't that interesting? Because it's Esau's land, right? And so Esau makes his way back to his homeland, and Jacob goes to this place called Succoth, which is apparently only about 4 miles from where they are standing. Now, it's interesting here, and I don't quite know how to make this out, but if you look back in verse 14, it seems that Jacob is promising Esau that he's going to go to his land, to Seir. Look at verse 14. So let my Lord go on ahead of his servant while I move along slowly at the pace of the droves before me and that of the children until I come to my Lord in Seir. So Jacob promises to go to Esau's land, but in the end, he doesn't. He goes to Succoth instead. Why is that? Scholars have debated this. What's going on? Is Jacob still not fully trust Esau? Is he still not too sure he wants to live in the same town with this guy? Maybe he'll change his mind. We're not really sure. Maybe Jacob's just so focused on the promise of God, he's like, I've got to go to Shechem. That's where I'm going. But somehow he makes Esau believe he's going to join him, but he doesn't join him. And then we read a summary here in verse 18. After Jacob came from Padam Aram, and this is a summary of the whole deal here, he arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan and camped within sight of the city. For 100 pieces of silver he bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. There he set up an altar and called it El Elohi Israel. And so we have Jacob at the end of the story, back in the land of his father Abraham. And not only is he back in the land, notice what? Notice he buys some land, right? So he actually owns the land at this point. You might find it interesting, too, that this is one of the few references to money in ancient accounts. Most of the time they're trading cattle and livestock, but somehow Jacob has money here, and he buys land with the money. Now, he's still living in a tent. He's still kind of in this temporary dwelling, but he's in the land. He's been obedient to God. He's followed God all the way from Padam Aram. He's stepped up. He's faced Esau. They're reconciled, and then he moves on to this land. And notice that when he gets in the land, what does he do? He builds an altar. And it's apparently in the same place where his grandfather Abraham had built an altar. Maybe he even reconstructs his grandfather's altar, and he worships God. But notice here it says what? He calls God El Elohi Israel, which means I'm worshiping the God of Israel. And what did God change Jacob's name to? Israel. So what's Jacob saying here? Jacob's saying, I'm not just worshiping the God of my father Isaac. I'm not just worshiping the God of my father Abraham, grandfather Abraham. I'm worshiping my God. You see, that's significant there. Because often we worship the God of our fathers, but we don't always worship our own God. Do you see? The God of Israel. He's my God. So it shows a transformation in Jacob's life, doesn't it? You see, Jacob's been on a journey, hasn't he? I mean, he did some pretty despicable things way back when, right? He makes his way over to Padam Aram, and again, the tables are turned. The trickster is tricked. And slowly, in about 20 years, that's pretty slow, isn't it? God turns Jacob into the man that he wants him to be. Significant account. He wrestles with him on the night before he meets Esau. But even more importantly than that, when he meets Esau, Jacob once again is provided with grace, with forgiveness, with reconciliation. Now, what does this have to do with you and me, you might ask? Let's think about that whole deal of reconciliation. To be reconciled. You know, many of us need to be reconciled to God, right? And coming to God is something that we've thought of, maybe you've thought of, and you're thinking, I need reconciliation with God, and I don't know how to do that. This morning, we're reminded as we come to the table this morning that it's not about what we do, is it? But rather it's about what He did for us. And so we are provided an opportunity to be reconciled with God. But reconciliation is not just this way, is it? It's also this way. It's also horizontal. And maybe there's some people in the room today that need to be reconciled with somebody. And, you know, that's hard, isn't it? And maybe there's hurt and pain and deceit along the way. And maybe we're going, I don't think that reconciliation with that person's possible. And there's two sides to reconciliation. Do you see that in the story? There's Jacob. He's the one who's wronged Esau, right? And I think this story teaches us something about what it means to be reconciled if we're on the side of the one who's wronged someone else, right? What do we do? What did Jacob do? He bowed down. He came in humility. He said, I'm sorry for all that I've done. Would you forgive me? It's a beautiful model of what it means to go to someone that we've wronged and to bow down. Not just once, but 7 times, right? And then we've got the picture of Esau. It's another model for reconciliation, isn't it? I mean, many times when someone's coming to us that's wronged us, if we've got 400 men, we're going to send the 400 men after them, aren't we? Take them out. They should get what they deserve, right? But instead, Esau does what? He runs. He runs to his brother, throws his arms around him, and accepts him. He offers grace and forgiveness. He models God in his forgiveness. Isn't that a beautiful picture? And so we've got this picture of Jacob and Esau being reconciled. I don't know this morning what God would be calling you to do. I think often, in another point, I think this is kind of a side point here, but Jacob could have went the other direction, couldn't he? I mean, he could have said, I'm not facing Esau. No way am I going that direction. But he steps with God into his past, into his unknown. Do you think maybe when Jacob was living in Padam Aram, he wondered every day if Esau was going to show up? You think it was kind of like the thing that kind of haunted him? He maybe had a dream that Esau was standing at the foot of his bed or something. He wakes up and screams. I don't know. But I bet that haunted him throughout the years. And in many ways, when we are living in an unreconciled relationship with people, that's what it's like. But God tells Jacob, look, I want you to go and I want you to face the one that you wronged. I want you to step into that. And Jacob courageously does that. He steps into it, faces up to it. And in the end, he's honored for that. In the end, reconciliation is possible. So what about us? I think the application for you and me is that we need to be reconciled with each other. And as we are reconciled with each other, we then can be reconciled with God. What an appropriate time for us to come to a table this morning and to remember the ultimate reconciliation, the reconciliation between God and you and me. And in a few minutes, we're going to come and do that. We're going to have a hymn of response this morning, and I'm going to ask you to stand. And as we come to this place, there's a decision that you'd like to make. You can come. I'll be standing down front. If joining this church is something that you want to do, I'll be standing down front. If you simply want to come and pray at the altar, you come and do that now. As we wrap up this time of response, we're going to move into communion.